Even if you do everything right, the world around you slowly begins to turn its back on you. Things start to go wrong. People drift away. The value you thought you had seems to evaporate into thin air. And then comes the silence, the oblivion, the feeling that, somehow, you no longer belong. This is exactly what Kafka wanted to show in the Metamorphosis. It is not just a story about a man who wakes up transformed into an insect. It is a parable about what happens when someone stops fulfilling the role others expect of him. Gregor Samsa wakes up and realizes he is no longer the same, but what really rots there is not his body. It is the bond that once united him with others. Family, affections, dignity. Everything collapses with the fall of his usefulness. Kafka did not write about monsters. He wrote about us. About the very thin layer of civility that sustains our relationships, and how fragile it is when confronted with difference, weakness, or failure. This video is an invitation to look at absurdity not as a literary element, but as a mirror, one you might rather not face. Franz Kafka is one of the most unique voices in existential literature. In texts like The Trial, The Castle, and especially The Metamorphosis, he portrays the anguish of living in a world where logic is opaque, justice is deaf, and identity is as fragile as glass. The Metamorphosis begins with a grotesque scene. An ordinary man, a traveling salesman, wakes up transformed into a monstrous insect. Gregor. The transformation needs no logic. It is a symbol of collapse, of the moment when everything that sustained his dignity, his work, his appearance, his voice becomes irrelevant. His family, once dependent, now reacts with repulsion. His father attacks him, his mother faints, his sister, who initially tries to care for him, gradually distances herself until she wishes for his death. In this work, Kafka shows horror not in what is different, but in what is revealed about us when difference imposes itself. The metamorphosis does not happen in Gregor. It happens in the people around him. And perhaps, if we are honest, it happens in us too. Have you ever noticed how fear changes people? How it turns simple gestures into violent defenses, silences into accusations, and bonds into walls? Everyone says love would withstand anything, but what if it can't withstand fear? Gregor Samsa, now deformed, no longer speaks the same language as the others, literally. His attempts to communicate sound like noises, clicks, something that causes discomfort even when he just wants to explain that everything is okay. But it's not. It never will be again. The family, seeing him in this new form, reacts with astonishment, panic, pure fear, fear of what he represents, a break from normalcy, a threat to the order that sustained the household. Sigmund Freud said that fear is a primary emotion that often disguises itself as anger. And that's exactly what we see in Gregor's father's reaction. The authoritarian figure, who once relied on his son's support, now feels he has lost control. And like any man cornered by the fear of losing his place, he attacks. He throws apples, yells, tries to expel Gregor as if chaos itself could be thrown out of the house. This is a common reaction when we face what we cannot control. Think about how we deal with illness, for example. How many times do we distance ourselves from someone who falls seriously ill? Not because we want to, but because we don't know how to be present in the face of suffering. The fear of our own helplessness paralyzes us, and when we can't flee, we attack. The sister is perhaps the most complex character. At first, she tries to care for Gregor with a certain dedication. She brings food, cleans the room, tries to adapt. But as his presence begins to compromise her own reputation, her freedom, and even the harmony of the home, she changes. Care turns into obligation. Obligation turns into annoyance. And annoyance turns into contempt. How often does this happen in real life? A loved one goes through an emotional crisis, a deep depression, a financial collapse, and little by little they become a burden to others. What was once compassion turns into exhaustion. The will to help turns into frustration, and the person who most needs support finds themselves isolated, as if they were to blame for not being well. Kafka distorts empathy, compromises reason, and reveals that our bonds are often more fragile than we believe. The family's reaction to Gregor is not an exception. It is a mirror of humanity. The fear here is not just of a deformed body. It is the fear of everything Gregor symbolizes: the failure of function, the collapse of social roles, the loss of order. He, who was once the provider, is now the center of discomfort. And society has a cruel history with those who no longer serve its system. Nietzsche said that man fears chaos, but does not realize that it is from chaos that the dancing star is born. But to see this star, one must endure discomfort, and few are willing to do so. Gregor's family, like so many other social structures, prefers to keep appearances intact, even if it means erasing what does not fit. Fear is natural. The problem is when we let it dictate our bonds, when we start treating others with aggression simply because they no longer match the image we had of them. Gregor, in his new form, is not rejected for being evil, but for being different, and the different, in this world, is almost always condemned. Perhaps the scariest thing is not the image of a insect, but the realization that, in the face of fear, we are all capable of abandoning those who need us most. Who would you be if, suddenly, you could no longer perform the role that defines you? What if what you do, what others expect of you, what you yourself believe you are, simply ceased to exist? Gregor Samsa was a traveling salesman who financially supported the household, paid his father's debts, and carried the burden of responsibility on his shoulders. He did not complain, but it only took one day of being unable to get out of bed, one morning when his body no longer responded as before, for everything that constituted him to start crumbling. When he loses his function, he loses his footing. And here Kafka touches on a sensitive point of existence, the illusion that we are our role, that we are worth what we produce, that we belong insofar as we contribute. Schopenhauer once said that suffering is born from attachment, and attachment to the self-image is one of the hardest to break. Gregor desperately tries to hold on to traces of his former life. He listens at the door to his family's conversations, is moved by music, wants to protect the portrait of the woman on the wall, as if clinging to a symbol of what he once was could prevent the complete loss of himself. But little by little, the identity built on usefulness begins to crumble, and what remains? A being who is no longer a man but still has feelings. The invisibility grows, not only in the eyes of others, but within himself. And the deepest pain may be this: realizing oneself to be irrelevant. This experience is not exclusive to Gregor. It echoes in anyone who has ever lost a job, ended a long-term relationship, or stopped performing a profession or social role that defined them. How many people fall into depression after retiring? How many mothers, once their children grow up, wonder who they are beyond motherhood? How many men, upon failing to be what society expects of them, fall silent in shame? For Jean-Paul Sartre, we are not defined by what we are, but by what we do with what we are. Even so, we live trapped by labels, functions, external expectations. When these structures collapse, we find ourselves facing the void. Camus spoke of the human attempt to find meaning in a universe that offers no answers. Gregor's story is absurd precisely because of this. There is no explanation for his transformation, just as there is no explanation for many of the things that happen to us. What remains, then, is the confrontation with nothingness, the need to invent a new meaning. But not everyone succeeds. Identity, in this context, reveals its fragility. We are not as strong as we think, and if our existence relies solely on the role we perform, we run the risk of disappearing when that role is taken from us. Kafka's script is cruel precisely because it is real. In the absence of function, the person becomes a problem, a nuisance, a figure that needs to be hidden. And this logic, deeply rooted in contemporary culture, distances us from true humanity. At first, Gregor still tries to maintain some dignity. Despite others' repulsion, he remains attentive to his family. He hides under the sofa so as not to frighten them, makes an effort to listen to their conversations, and even gets emotional when his sister plays the violin. At this moment, there is still a trace of humanity, the desire to be seen not just as a deformed body, but as someone who still feels, who still loves, who still exists. But this care gradually wears down, because no affection can withstand continuous abandonment. With each new exclusion, each reaction of disgust, each silent or explicit aggression, something inside Gregor dies. This process, described by Kafka with almost unbearable harshness, is not just a metaphor for exclusion. It is an anatomy of depression. First comes the shock, then the attempt to adapt, followed by resentment, and finally, complete emptiness. Gregor no longer tries to communicate. He stops eating. He drags himself around aimlessly. His only motivation becomes not to bother, not to exist too much. The physical transformation, which seemed to be the greatest drama at the beginning of the story, becomes secondary to the emotional dissolution. Gregor's greatest terror is not being an insect. It is realizing that even with all the effort to please, to serve, to be useful, he was still discarded. This type of emotional fall is common in people who go through prolonged rejection. In environments where there is no support, the individual internalizes others' rejection as a personal failure. They begin to believe that they indeed deserve to be cast aside, that maybe the world was right to exclude them. It is here that Kafka touches on a universal point of pain. The moment when someone stops fighting, not out of cowardice, but from exhaustion. Not from lack of desire, but from no longer finding anywhere to anchor it. And perhaps the most disturbing part is realizing that all this happens inside the home. It is not the external world that rejects Gregor, it is his own family. This dismantles the romanticized idea of home as an unconditional place of welcome. The house can also be the scene of the cruelest abandonment, because it is where love is expected, and when it doesn't come, the pain is doubled. In the end, Gregor does not die because of the metamorphosis itself, but because of everything it reveals. The indifference of others, the harshness of their gazes, the impatience with his presence, the frustration that he is no longer who he used to be, the absence of any sincere gesture of empathy. He dies when he accepts that there is no longer a place for him in the world of men. And the most tragic part is that no one inside that house seems to truly mourn him. This is the point where the narrative becomes unbearable for those who read with an open heart. Because deep down, we know that we have already done this to someone, or that we have already been in Gregor's place, silent, withdrawn, trying not to bother, just existing in silence, hoping that someone still sees us. By this point in the story, shame had already taken hold of everyone. Gregor felt ashamed of his own body, his own condition, his very existence. He hid and repressed himself. He had already started to believe that maybe he really was a monster. This is the most devastating effect of shame. It doesn't just exclude, it contaminates identity. The person stops thinking they are wrong. They start thinking they are the wrong. But it wasn't just Gregor who felt shame. Everyone in that house had been consumed by it. The father felt ashamed of depending on his son, and later of having to go back to work. The mother felt ashamed for being unable to love her son in his new form. Thomas Hobbes said that shame is one of the most effective tools of social control. Shame shapes behaviors, imposes invisible limits, defines what can and must be hidden. Kafka turns this idea into literature. He shows how shame functions as an instrument of exclusion. Now think how many people live trapped in identities they didn't choose, afraid to show who they are. How many children hide their feelings, their pain, out of shame. How many men suppress their own tears because they were taught that vulnerability is weakness. How many women stay silent in abusive relationships out of fear of being judged. Shame is one of the most perverse mechanisms of life in society because it acts from the inside out. This happens in our daily lives more than we imagine. Some people start believing that the best thing they can do is to withdraw, that their presence bothers others, that it would be a relief if they simply disappeared. And this feeling is born from the sum of small things, unanswered messages, averted gazes, silences that hurt more than any spoken word. It is this kind of shame that slowly makes a person fade away. It's not that they choose to give up on life, it's that, at a certain point, life stops making sense when everything they were has been invalidated, when they no longer have a voice, nor space, nor a role within what once was their home. And when someone close, who once offered support, finally says or makes it clear, "We no longer know what to do with you," they are no longer part of it, not as a person, only as a nuisance to be avoided. This is the power of shame as a social force. It transforms the other into a thing, into an obstacle, into something that needs to be hidden so that order can be restored. And this order, in the end, is about maintaining appearances. Kafka's work shows us how hard we try to keep facades intact, even if it costs the exclusion of those close to us. Shame does not destroy all at once. It corrodes, little by little. And the cruelest part is that, often, it is caused by those who claim to love. Kafka did not write about monsters. He wrote about people, about the fragility of bonds, about the fear we have of what is strange and of what escapes our control. Gregor did not die because he turned into an insect. He died because he stopped being useful, because he no longer fit what others expected of him. And that says more about us than about him. What do you do when someone around you breaks? When they lose their shape, their role, their function? Ignoring these questions can make us worse than the Samsa family, polished on the outside, but blind on the inside. So, before judging, turning away, or wishing the other would disappear, observe. Maybe the true metamorphosis is our ability to look at the excluded with human eyes. If you enjoyed this content and want to understand more about life's questions, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who is also among the awakened.